My name is Greg Abbey, and I work with DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, and I am our sustainability program developer. I'm here today to talk about the different things that we do related to sustainability, which for us isn't just related to greenhouse gas emissions, it's also related to resiliency and indoor air quality. So what we'll talk about today, and this will be not too long of a presentation. I'm hoping to have a good amount of time for questions and answers at the end. But we'll talk about some of Massachusetts' goals, what's the state doing, what are DHCD's sustainability initiatives related to emissions, resiliency, indoor air quality, and so on. We'll do some myth busters towards the end. I've been working in energy efficiency and sustainability for a long time, and I've got a whole bunch of common things that folks ask about. And so we'll touch on a few of those. And then at the end, we'll talk about things that you can do. So before we kick it off, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about the greenhouse effect and why reducing emissions is a useful thing. This is probably familiar to many of you, but the greenhouse effect is essentially increasing a blanket of certain types of gases in the air that help the planet heat up. So oftentimes, or really the way it works is the sun sends radiation down to Earth. A lot of it is absorbed by the surface and warms it up. But a good portion of that radiation is reflected off the Earth and back out into space through the atmosphere. And depending on what types of gases there are in the atmosphere, and this can be carbon dioxide, methane, different refrigerants, they act as better insulators of the Earth. And so a lot of that reflected radiation doesn't go back into space. It stays within the atmosphere and slowly starts to warm the planet up over decades, centuries, and so on. So that's what the greenhouse effect is, and that's why we want to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because if we can do that, then we keep that insulating layer on the thin side, allowing that radiation to bounce back into space and regulate Earth's temperature better. To bring it a little closer to home, these are some fun little maps, and I know that they look small, so that's okay. I'll tell you what they are. These are maps that you can find on different Massachusetts websites. The one on the left is showing the number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in 2050. These are some of the projections. So those sort of darker colors that you can see sort of through central Mass there and up a little bit on the North Shore, those are 21 to 27 days above 90 in 2050. So you can see it's the central part of the state where it starts to get a little more mountainous, that it's going to be warmer. Much of the rest of the state is looking at least 12 to 21, and then really just kind of down South Shore, Cape Islands, you're still looking at 9 to 12. So it's expected to get warmer the way that things are going. Down in the bottom right, you'll see a map of Boston, Cambridge, some of Somerville there, East Boston. And the really dark red that you can see along the Esplanade, just where my cursor is, I don't know if you can see it, but that's okay if you can't. The dark red is areas that we expect will flood if there's 1 foot of sea level rise. As the colors in that map get lighter, those are increasing amounts of sea level rise and where we think things will flood. So the lightest color, the really light yellow, is 6 feet of sea level rise. And you can see at that point, Copley, the Prue, a whole bunch of South Boston, a lot of the Seaport, Faneuil Hall and City Hall Plaza, all of that is inundated. And lastly, up in the top right, this is a map showing an observed increase in very heavy precipitation from 1958 to 2012. So this isn't just more rain, it's that when it does rain, it rains much harder. And you get much more rain in one single storm. And you can see New England up in the top right, 71% increase in very heavy precipitation from 1958 to 2012. So we've got more heat to deal with. We've got increased amounts of rainfall that we have to deal with, and we've got sea level rise and storm surge that we have to deal with. And all of these are contributed to and accelerated by the greenhouse effect. So that's why we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So let's talk a little bit about Massachusetts goals from a very high level. I promise I won't go into policy stuff too much here, but there are some important laws that are on the books. Climate Bill S9, this came out just a couple of years ago, and it set the state's greenhouse gas limits at net zero by 2050, meaning we want to reduce it as much as possible, and then anything that can't be reduced, offset it with some type of negative emissions, which could be planting more trees, it could be carbon sequestration technology, which is really cutting edge and not quite ready yet. But what this bill also did was it set incremental goals for the Commonwealth in 2030, 35, 40, 45, and then 50. So it's not just net zero by 2050, we've got to keep going. And then it seems someone has annotated over my greenhouse gas emissions there. I wonder if I can. Ooh, that's fun. Well, we'll keep going. There we go. Thanks. Climate Bill H5060. This said a few different things. It said we need to bring more renewable power onto the grid, and in particular offshore windmills, which is a pretty exciting thing off of the South Coast. We're looking at fewer fossil fuels, and in particular, the mass save programs, which many of you may have heard of before. They will be required to start winding down their support of fossil fuel fired equipment and more electric vehicles. And in particular, increasing incentives at the state level, not just for electric vehicles, but different groups of people. So for example, folks with certain incomes will get additional incentives to help pay for electric vehicles, really get the market moving quicker. So that's on the legislative side. And on the executive branch side, Executive Order 594 said that state agencies like DHCD have to lead by example. So we have to do what we can to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions using the authorities that our agency has. So to boil all of this down, reducing greenhouse gas emissions isn't just a good thing to do for the future, it's also mandatory per state law and all these other things. But let's talk now about resiliency. What is resiliency? Essentially, it's how do we adapt to a more uncertain weather future, that extreme heat, rainfall. What do we do to prepare for those types of weather hazards? What the state's done is they've done, and we've got another acronym here for you. We love acronyms. The SHMCAP initiative, which is the State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. What it did was it told state agencies, again, like DHCD, to identify resiliency vulnerabilities, places that will be impacted by extreme rain, heat, sea level rise, storm surge, and then make plans to try to improve the resiliency of those areas or facilities. And that'll be important in just a moment. So what does DHCD have to do with all of this? Well, DHCD, and particularly the Division of Public Housing, which is the division in which I work, we help housing authorities all across Massachusetts improve their facilities. We help them with funding. We help them with technical guidance. We've got engineers and architects on staff that review all types of improvements to buildings and sites and developments. And so we try and encourage housing authorities to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, make things more resilient, and improve the indoor air quality of buildings. So how do we go about doing that? Well, on the greenhouse gas emission front, we've got sustainability awards. So part of my job is to administer a budget of about $5 million a year. and I can make grants to housing authorities that will help do different types of building improvements that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And these vary. You've got weatherization, which is insulation and air sealing, making buildings more comfortable. Better heating and cooling equipment, making them more efficient, moving towards electrification, generally speaking, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Improved lighting, upgrading from older, inefficient lighting to more efficient LED lighting that tends to last a lot longer too. And reduced water consumption, which isn't so much related to greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also important, so we include it. Improved toilets that use much less water per flush. We can help with financial assistance to do those types of projects. And ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish is we want to try and have all of the routine things that housing authorities do. If it's replacing a roof, replacing siding, replacing a kitchen, the cabinets, the appliances, you name it, we want to try and have each of those be a little bit better than it might have without our intervention, so that every project reduces greenhouse gas emissions in one way or another. On the resiliency front, we also have awards that can help housing authorities make their developments more resilient. And in particular, we completed what we call the CHARM study. Again, another acronym. Love the acronyms. CHARM is the Climate Hazard Adaptation and Resiliency Master Plan. There's no test at the end. You don't need to memorize that. But the important thing is we looked at every single state-aided housing authority development, and we said, how vulnerable is this development to sea level rise and storm surge, rainfall flooding, and extreme heat over the next, say, 30 to 40 years? And we went through all those different developments. We updated all of our systems that housing authorities use so that they're able to see, hey, I'm working on this particular development and it's vulnerable to extreme heat. So I need to make sure that the particular projects that I'm working on take that into account. Very easy example. Let's say you need to replace a roof and you realize that from this study and the updates we've made, this development is vulnerable to extreme heat. We want you to make that the roof a lighter color so that it reflects sunlight off the roof, keeps that building cooler, keeps it more comfortable for everybody inside, and it uses less energy. These awards are the same sort of financial assistance that I talked about before. We want to make every improvement more resilient. Again, whether it's the roof, the siding, pavement, you name it, we've got some sort of a small adjustment that we can make so that each of these different types of projects is more resilient. And for those developments that are very at risk, we want to put together larger projects that do more all at once to try and make those developments more resilient much quicker. And lastly, indoor air quality. There isn't necessarily, that I'm familiar with at least, any sort of state level initiative related to indoor air quality, but it's something that we really care about. And so we do financial assistance through indoor air quality, or IAQ awards, to housing authorities. Largely, these revolve around improved ventilation, so installing bath fans where there are none currently, or range hoods over your stove. We also help housing authorities electrify their stoves. So if you've got a gas stove or a propane stove, and you want to electrify it, we can help do that. We also have posted on our website a Healthy Building Network resource guide, which can help housing authorities and their residents look for healthier cleaning products, healthier carpet materials, the sorts of things that you would put inside a building. We want to try and minimize the harmful chemical exposure that can come from those different types of products and materials. And it's important. Folks spend a lot of time indoors. Depending on the particular building, the indoor air quality can be as good or worse in some places than the outdoor air quality. So trying to get that right matters a great deal. And I see that Mary has a hand raised. I know that we were saving questions to the end, but I see the hand
Oh,
raised.
I can do
So,
that. I didn't hear that part. I can
oh,
wait.
that's okay. If you'd like to ask your question now, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, no, you said say the question, so I'm gonna be
Oh.
respectful and do that.
Oh, okay.
All right,
Very
thank
good.
you, Darwin.
We'll get back to you. There are some other opportunities to do different types of projects that are outside of DHCD. Many of you may be familiar with the Mass Save program, and particularly their income eligible arm of the program. It's often called LEAN because it works with a network of cap agencies and the Low Income Energy Affordability Network, which is what LEAN stands for. And they make all kinds of improvements to buildings, very similar to what I was describing before: weatherization, heating and cooling system improvements, and so on, typically at no cost to those who qualify. And so that can be a huge benefit. There's also a brand new program that they announced maybe 2 weeks ago that's called the Deep Energy Retrofit Program. And in that, there are some very compelling incentives related to large projects that do a ton of work all at once. And particularly, they're looking for an energy savings of 40% or greater for just one big project. So it's a high bar, but if it can be achieved, there's a lot of incentive backing that up. So that's pretty exciting too. And DOER, the Department of Energy Resources, recently received some funding from the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level. It made its way down, and they are putting together an initiative that will also help property owners reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by making big renovations. So there are a lot of different opportunities these days to improve buildings, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and on DHCD's side, to make the developments more resilient and have better indoor air quality. So those are, at a high level, a whole bunch of the opportunities that are out there and kind of what DHCD is trying to do to help with those efforts. Let's pivot now, and we'll talk about some of the common myths that might be out there. Maybe you've heard of some of these before. Before I worked at DHCD, I worked as an energy auditor. So I went into people's homes, tried to figure out why it is their bills were so high, why it is the upstairs corner bedroom is always colder than the other rooms, all that kind of stuff. And so some of these are directly out of that line of work. So fact or fiction, you can overseal a building. You can make it too tight. A building needs to breathe. Well, that's correct. You can overseal a building. It's hard to do it, but you can do it. A blower door test can determine exactly where that threshold is, where it's too tight or it's just right. And a blower door test looks like this. What you do is you put this frame in an open doorway and you put a shroud over it with a fan and you turn the fan on. And the fan pulls air out of the house and blows it outside, but it pulls in air through any place that's got a leak. So it could be coming in from the basement, could be coming down a chimney, a lot of different places. And you can take a very specific measurement of how much air is moving and determine how tight is that building. You want to try and get the building as tight as possible without being too tight. But in a lot of high performance buildings these days, a very tight building is paired with mechanical ventilation. So you have a very tight building, and then you install an intentional ventilation system that pulls fresh air in from outside and exhausts indoor air directly outside. And it runs it through a heat exchanger that I think in most cases are 95% efficient. They're very, very good. And so the occupants have fresh air all the time. And the building is really, really tight, thus reducing energy loss out of the building, and it tends to be much more comfortable. There's not really, it's difficult to put a dollar value on what comfortable is, but when you feel it, it's a pretty great thing. So it's true that you can overseal a building. Oversealing is not a good thing unless you pair it with ventilation. Another myth, heat pumps are junk. Many of you have probably heard of heat pumps before. Some of the common myths that I've heard is that the air that they put out, it's not comfortable, or when it's really cold outside, heat pumps don't work, or they don't really save any energy. These are some of the common things that I've heard here and there. So first, let's talk about what a heat pump is. And I know that that image on the right is a little out of focus, and that's kind of intentional because there's a lot of words down at the bottom that aren't really important at the moment. I like it because it has colorful arrows. Heat pumps don't actually make any heat. They don't create heat. All that they do is they move heat from one location to another. So in the heating season, which is what that graphic on the right is showing, what happens is the outdoor unit on the right takes air that's outside and it absorbs heat out of the air. Now, it's kind of hard to conceptualize if it's 30 degrees outside that there's heat in the air, but there is. It's definitely warmer there than it is in, say, outer space where there's no heat. So it takes heat, it sends it in refrigerant to the inside unit, and then it takes that heat and blows it into the room. And then it is heating the space in that way. Heat pumps these days can work even when it's negative 15 degrees outside. I've actually got one on the wall just over here. And on that really, really cold day a few months ago, it was still able to make some heat. It was cooler. I mean, it was probably 68 in here, but it wasn't cold. I just had to put on another layer. And then in the cooling season, heat pumps act as air conditioners. They take heat that's inside the building and they send it outside the building. So that's how heat pumps work. Those myths that I mentioned are not true. Heat pumps can be really, really great. And they're really great for a few reasons. The first, and this is the reason they're so popular right now, is that as the electric grid gets cleaner, heat pumps and really anything that's electric and attached to the grid also gets cleaner. So when you burn a gallon of oil, you burn a gallon of oil and that emits the greenhouse gas emissions that it emits. When you run a heat pump attached to the electric grid, as the grid gets cleaner, you put more wind turbines on it or solar panels like you see on the right, then the energy that's being consumed, the emissions are going down over time. So it's a really good thing from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. It can provide heat these days, like I said, when it's negative 15 degrees outside in many cases. They provide air conditioning, which is increasingly important as we're getting warmer and warmer and warmer, like we saw on that slide earlier. COP stands for the coefficient of performance. It's basically how efficient do heat pumps operate. For comparison, a gas furnace is about 0.95% or 0.95% efficient. That's about right. 95% efficient. That means that for every unit of fuel that it puts in, 95% of that goes into the building, and you lose about 5% out the chimney. Those are the most efficient gas furnaces these days. Heat pumps, when it's warm outside, say 47 degrees, they can be 2.9, which is 290% efficient. And that means you put in 1 unit of electricity and you get 2.9 units of heat out of it. Because again, it's not making heat, it's just moving it from place to place. And even when it's cold out, say 17 degrees, they are 2.5 times more efficient than that gas furnace 2.5. And heat pumps are relatively new in New England, but they're not new in the United States or in the world. They've been installed all over the mid-Atlantic and the South for a long, long time. Only in recent years did they get to be so efficient that they can make a lot of heat when it's really cold outside. But like any piece of heating and cooling equipment, they have to be installed properly, they have to be operated properly, and they have to be maintained well. And on the operations side, I'm happy to share this afterwards, but there's a really great heat pump guide that Efficiency Maine put together. This is an organization up in Maine that encourages folks to use heat pumps, and they provide a lot of incentives. They're kind of like Mass Save. And this heat pump guide talks about very effective operation practices that anyone with a heat pump can use. So for example, number 2, set it and forget it in the winter. I think a lot of us, myself included, are accustomed to when you leave the house or when you go to sleep, you want to turn the temperature down a few degrees, save yourself some energy. With heat pumps, it actually is more efficient if you just set the temperature to something that's comfortable and then don't touch it again. Heat pumps have a motor that doesn't just go off and on. It can go off, it can be 10% on, 30% on, 50%, 70%. So it's variable, and it's much more efficient if it's just having to maintain a certain temperature by operating maybe 20% capacity, as opposed to you shut the whole thing off and you have to heat the whole house up again at 100% capacity. Similar, set for comfort regardless of your usual boiler or furnace setting. Again, something I'm very accustomed to is if you've got a boiler, the recommended temperature from the Department of Energy, I think it is 68 degrees in the winter. For some heat pumps, that might feel comfortable, but it might not in other cases because heat pumps just heat differently than boilers do. So it could be that for you, 73 is more comfortable. And if that's the case, you set your heat pump to 73 degrees and you let it go. And it stays at that temperature and maintains it comfortably. A lot of heat pumps have an auto mode, which will switch back and forth between heating and cooling, depending on what the room is experiencing. That tends to not be particularly efficient because it might go off and on and off and on, heat and cool and heat and cool and heat and cool. It's better to just set it for heat, let it heat, and then when it's warm enough, it winds its way down, and then it turns back on to reheat it, as opposed to leaving it in that automatic mode. And the last couple of things I'd point to are you can use the controls on heat pumps these days, particularly the ductless ones like you see down on the bottom right. You can adjust where the air blows. You can aim it up, down, left, right, all over the place. So they're pretty customizable, room by room, to whatever's comfortable. Let's talk about another myth. There's nothing people can do about high utility costs. I'm sure you noticed this past winter, electric bills and gas bills went through the roof. They went through the roof for a whole host of different reasons, but something I heard from a lot of different folks was, well, that's just the utility companies and there's nothing I can do about it. I just have to deal with it, essentially. That isn't completely true. Many folks are able to do all kinds of different things related to energy costs. If you pay your own bills, if you live in a community where you are responsible for paying bills, the utilities have discount rates for electric and gas. I forget exactly what the discount is, but I think it's over 10% of the particular rate. And so each utility has a phone number that you can call, get yourself signed up for those rates. For housing authorities, generally, you can do sustainability related work through either DHCD or Mass Save Income Eligible program. Again, make your building more efficient, make it better insulated, more airtight, but not too much. And that will all reduce utility consumption, reducing costs. You can also do on-site solar. This is something that was a little out of reach for a lot of housing authorities and other property owners in the past, but is not as much anymore. There are programs that exist now where housing authority, for example, could put solar on their site at no upfront cost. The panels are owned by a third party. They're operated, they're maintained, insured, the whole deal. And the housing authority pays a flat power purchase agreement electric rate for 20 so odd years, which is a pretty good deal to have your utility cost locked in for 20 years. So that's one other way to control your energy costs. And then there's community solar, where rather than having solar right on your site, someone, a developer, is building a big solar array someplace else. Maybe it's over a capped landfill, maybe it's on the side of the highway. And then essentially what the community does is it buys a portion of that solar array through another power purchase agreement style arrangement, where you're paying your utility bill to the developer, but you're getting a lower rate in return. So there are some ways that you can take control of energy costs. So what are some other things that you all can do? And this is our last slide here, and then we'll move into questions and answers. Takeaways from today: climate change is getting worse. It'll have health, economic, cultural, ecological impacts, and Massachusetts has laws in place that commit us to dealing with it as soon as we can, which is in everybody's best interest. And housing authorities and their residents and all residents of Massachusetts have a role to play. We can try and advocate to make every building improvement more resilient, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and be better for people's health. And a big thing is just to go and ask people what more can be done. Hey, we're seeing that there's this particular thing going on in our community. What can we do to try and make that better? New technology can seem really complex, and in some cases it is, but at least from my perspective, that's what I am here for. I'm here to help demystify some of those things, help people get a handle on how to use it better, and talk through some of the potential solutions. So there are a lot of different opportunities out there, DHCD or otherwise, and we can take control of them all together and work towards a brighter future.